the Superior Court of a county in which such residential subdivision is located. Just wanted to point that out, because obviously we're dense and kind of compact. So that'd be something that any of these that come before us, assuming approval of this language moving forward, that'd be something that the fire marshal would have to take a look at during the review process. But just want to run this by y'all, see if y'all had any input for us, any other ideas, and see where we want to go.
Questions?
I do. I'm trying to find the language you just read.
So it's going to be highlighted in blue. It's going to be subpart G.
Why don't I see it? Hold on. Oh, here we go. So how is subdivision defined? Because when I think of subdivision, I think of I guess the general term of a cluster of houses. What is that effect on something that's more like just a neighborhood but not a subdivision?
So I have to, unfortunately, I got a number of different subdivision definitions that are running around in my head. Right. So I'd have to pull up the one how we define it in the UDC. But I'll give you an example. Like in the county, the way it's defined is 5 or more splits of a lot of record is defined as a subdivision.
Okay.
So my assumption would be that it'd be something similar to that type of language, but I'd have to, it would be subject to how we define subdivision.
So I would say that at this point, that would be my only question or concern, is the interpretation of that.
Yes, ma'am.
So that we're not protecting one subdivision, but not a neighborhood.
Yes, ma'am.
So if we can get some additional information with that, then I'll be good with that.
Okay.
I have a question. I was kind of tab aside, kind of missed somebody. Okay, where did you say the language you got here is from where?
It's from state code.
State code. Okay, so are there any crematories here in Fowler County now?
I believe there's one at Conner Westbury,
Right,
and that's in the county.
okay.
I think Woodlawn's got one out there too. It's off the side of the main building,
And where?
Old Hastings, out on Emory Road.
Okay.
And I know at the time that the one in the county went in, I would say it was around like 2008, 2009, somewhere around that neighborhood. This language here is this current language. It looks like it was from 2010. So I don't know if they went through some updates and some changes, but this was essentially what between Brett and the fire marshal provided.
I was asking because I wasn't sure whether we have licensed crematories here, because usually when a crematory go into a county, you hear the people complaining about it, but I've never heard anybody say anything about it.
Yeah, no, there was nobody that brought in an issue with the one that they said Conner was very bad.
And it's the 1,000 feet from where the crematory is, or is it front door going straight out and around the street back to the front door of the residence, or how is?
So obviously measurement is always an issue, as you know, like with alcohol ordinances and things of that nature. It does not define currently in this language. I'm looking through it real quick, but we can do a little bit more research on that, see how the point of travel measurement, or if it's like as the crow flies.
See how the state.
Sure.
So because even in reading this, do we have any restrictions about, I guess the funeral home is commercial.
Correct.
So obviously in terms of zoning, it would have to be there, but our zoning is also wonky in some places.
Yes,
So I know, I have a general idea of where we have funeral homes now, but I guess my question is like going forward, we love to put businesses in houses, in Griffin. And so I think that would be my question again, kind of going back to that subdivision is, if I buy the house and I put it and it's not a subdivision, now you got a funeral home and a crematorium right in the middle of a block.
Sure.
So I know that like this, they're saying a provision of 1,000 feet, but yeah, I just have questions about all of that.
I'll pull up how we define subdivision, and also we'll review, kind of research the measurement, how the state will measure that. My guess on that is we'll be okay, but let me do some research on it.
Yeah, I'm generally not opposed to a crematory being in city limits. I just don't want this to be somebody, a house gets sold in a neighborhood and now it's completely different.
Absolutely agree.
Any other questions?
Chad, I think you said distance requirement from subdivisions in state law.
Yes, this is
Go
in,
to the state's definition of,
correct.
it's not how we define it locally.
Okay.
I went here from the beginning. I asked them to put this on the agenda. As you all know, Mr. Charles Burden purchased what was once Heritage Funeral Home. What was the building? What was it?
The Elks Club.
The Elks Club building.
Yes, sir.
And he wants to,
Oh, okay.
he wants to put a crematory out there, and he asked me about it, and I called Chad, and there were no regulations for crematory, and he's made a significant investment in our community, and I want to be as best we can to be partners with him to help him be as successful as he possibly can. There are crematories in the county at other funeral homes, and he just wants that same opportunity to try to be competitive, to be successful, a successful business in the city. And I appreciate Chad going the extra mile to try to assist this business owner in doing so. So I'm for whatever we need to do to help this move along and address some of the concerns that all the concerns that Ms. Flowers have. Just whatever we got to do to try to help him move this along. It's going to help him bring more business to our community.
Any other questions?
I have one other.
Yes, ma'am.
Environmentally,
Yes, ma'am.
is there any restrictions in that code about crematories?
None that I'm aware of, and this may actually be a question for Mr. Haynes, who's here. But I believe that in the installation process, like with the smokestack, so to speak, that there's like scrubbers and things of that nature that, for those types of concerns. That would all be subject to building code.
Okay.
Anything else? Thank you, Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you.
Second item is to presentation of City of Griffin's cross drain replacement program, phase 1, Director of Watershed Management, Dr. Frank Keller will present. Keller.
2 years back, we got a chief loan for $4.0 million. Two of the major improvement projects, one is under Memorial Park. We did not have to tear it apart. We were able to deal with that issue while the pipe was in place. The second project is at the golf course. Many of y'all have seen the bandit log out there. We don't have floatables floating in the lake any longer. And then the third part of this picture is to restart repairing $30 million worth of failed infrastructure in the stormwater department due to age. And the reason for this morning was not to belabor it, but wanted to bring it to your attention as we develop the list and finalize that list. Will be in people's front yards. We will have a public hearing on this once we get started to let people know where this is. It's approximately 56 to 60 cross drains, and we will be in the magnitude probably of 365 days in construction because they'll have to move from point A to point B. It's not quite that easy as just doing a straight pipe replacement. Just wanted to bring to your attention if your constituents call you what is fixing to happen over the next 60 days.
Where these red dots are, is that where the projects will be?
Right now.
Is that the totality of the project is 365, but like not the individual disruption?
No, the time schedule is 365 days. The intention is to go into that particular area, fix it, get it paved and move on,
Okay,
all right? To leave that open for a year, I believe you guys might have a few phone calls.
well, yeah, that's why I'm like.
Yeah, and as you know, we try to minimize that, make your life easier, but just wanted to bring it to your attention.
And we're in phase 3 at this point.
Well, it's the last phase, yes. We're gonna get as many done as possible depending on construction costs. There'll be some more added if we have funding.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Next item is to discuss revisions of Chapter 30, cemeteries of the Code of Griffin, Georgia, and proposed increases in services provided by the cemetery.
Good morning.
Director of Public Works Department, Chris
I
Walker.
guess we'll start with the cemetery fee schedule. The last time we went up on these fees at cemetery was 2011, I believe. We're just making some adjustments just to inflation, cost of our business out there. So roughly $100 per item if you look at it. But I've got some stuff on here, some new items that we're offering I want to touch base with too. But if you guys want to look over the list and we can discuss any fees that you see that maybe have questions on. The section at the bottom left is the family columbariums. This is something that it's new for us to offer. This kind of gives you a little different feel from the traditional columbariums that we have that have 60, 70 spots in them. These will be there's 2 niches, 4 niches, and 6 niches. I think we're only showing the 2 and 4. There is one offered at six niches in there. And so you can put 2 urns in each one of those. So basically, a 2 niche family could be, we're hopeful people, or 4 sets of ashes. Any questions on any of the fees there?
And has that been built already?
Those are in place currently.
Okay.
Yes, they were approved in the last budget year. We just got those in though. Rebecca, when was that? A couple of weeks ago?
About 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, so it's set up there on the backside of the office. If you ride through, you can see it right on the backside of the pond. We've got a little section there with sidewalk going through. We've got the big columbarium that we're buying, waiting on it to be constructed. We're waiting on it now. It'll be set up there too.
Any questions?
Next item is going to be the ordinance. We've found a few things that we were missing. I believe some of these were actually in the ordinance before, the old ordinance, and then somehow or another we dropped them out of there. Basically just a little cleanup for us, but discussing burial vaults, somehow we had discovered we didn't have a burial in a vault. We've always enforced that, so we want to make sure that's in our ordinance. So that's all we're doing is adding that language back. Burials must have a vault. The next one is access to cemetery. This really is based on some of the homeless issues that are going on around here. We're having a lot of night visitors at the cemetery, so we'd like to try to clean that up anywhere or help PD be able to actually do something about it if they catch somebody in there.
Have you caught anybody in there?
Have I? No, I haven't. I've seen people in there, but I haven't got anybody. I'm not really wanting to grab people in the cemetery at night. Sir?
Signage.
We are. We actually got a project with gates going, this year in the budget, hopefully, so that'll be in conjunction with that too.
So let me just ask this.
Yes, ma'am.
I clearly see that it says it'll be unlawful, but in the event that somebody is out there before sunup and it's a family member, like, is there any room for us to?
Yeah, I think so. I think Jessica actually brought that up, that the language we had in there, it's a family member, we can have leeway with that,
Okay, because if somebody wants to come watch the
Right.
sunrise with their family.
I don't think that we would ever have a problem with that.
Okay.
And I don't think sunrise is gonna be a problem either. I mean, it's gonna be, but you never know.
Yeah, just, is there some wiggle room for someone to say,
Absolutely.
this is my family member and, okay.
I think the way it's written, it gives the police department an opportunity to use some independent investigation and decide this person is really here and this is the day of this person's death and they want to sit here with them and that's fine. But it also gives them the opportunity to say, you're just in here drinking or doing something you shouldn't be doing, you gotta go.
Okay,
Right now, we don't have a way to really do that because it is public space.
okay.
We've also had, I think, like the Historical Society having different evening, like,
If it were a
events with that, those type of things that people
Well,
can
then-
register with the,
Consent of the cemetery
so
superintendent.
that would all be taken care of for special events and things like that.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions?
Are those the only changes?
Well, we've got, section 3036, which will be covered by general care, which basically is talking about perpetual care, and that's our maintenance of the lots, but it also goes into discuss the, damages, any damages. If you've seen some of the walls that are collapsed out there or any damage to monuments, it basically just says we're not responsible for it. Now, I'll say this, if we cause the damage, we generally repair it. If it's caused by accident or mower or whatever, we usually take care of those. But anything else, we wouldn't be responsible for. The next one is the transfer sale of cemetery lots. I want to discuss this especially. This is a issue for us at times. This covers where John Doe buys a lot or buys a 16 grade plot in the whole section and family comes in and we get caught in the middle of this all the time where families are arguing about who's supposed to be buried in there, who's supposed to be buried here or there, and nobody ever has any proof. Or we have the situations where Mr. and Ms. Smith bought 2 lots at the cemetery 20 years ago and they decided to move out of town, so they sell it to their neighbors. They come in and tell us it's their lot, but we don't, our record shows Mr. and Ms. Smith owned it. And it's something we don't want to get caught up in because we really don't have ways to reach out to Mr. and Ms. Smith again. I mean, there's obviously we just had names and addresses most of the time back in the day when we sold those lots. So it could cause us some problems, some grief if we get caught in the middle of those. So we prefer they have proof of ownership or proof of permission to, before we can allow them to be buried in, spot.
So in the example you just provided with the neighbor, they moved, they sold
Yes, ma'am.
the lot. And then without any way to verify that, then the lot just won't be used.
Well, I don't know what else, I don't know what our options are in that.
No, I'm just trying to
But you're correct. I mean, if that's the situation, but I would think if you're gonna purchase a lot from someone, you should make sure you have the proper sales. Jessica, I did notice that we, added in here, shall transfer any sale, assign any lot without consent of city manager for which fee. We don't have fees set up for that.
No, and I think.
This has been a problem ever since I've been city attorney.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened is from the time the city of Griffin was founded and laid out cemeteries, the cemetery lots are just like any other property, like the lot your house is on. And if you take a deed from the owner who's the seller, goes to the purchaser, that deed needs to be recorded in the land records in the clerk's office.
Makes sense.
And that applies to cemetery lots. But as a rule of practice, it doesn't appear to have happened. City sold lots up until 1967, after which you declared your cemeteries to be in perpetual care and you started giving out burial rights contracts. Although we have found some occasions where there was still deeds given even after that date, which they should not have been. But in 67, you provided for a conversion and you asked the people who held deeds to cemetery lots to bring them back in. And you would convert those to a burial rights contract. But I don't think we had but about somewhere between 20-25%. It looks like you actually did that. So we've still got folks in the old section who are getting the benefit of perpetual care on those lots, but who still are holding deeds. And as Chris says, there's no way to, they've just exchanged between themselves, and not recorded these deeds. There's no way to trace this if they don't come back to us. I mean, we don't even have a a registry as such if they don't bring it back and tell us about it.
Any questions?
You have anything else?
Question?
Thank you. And final item is to discuss City of Griffin's current nuisance abatement program. Deputy City Manager Jesse O'Connor, Planning and Development Director Chad Jacobs, and Building Official Brett Haynes are with us.
We made it through quickly so far, but that's not gonna last. So. All right, so we are back with y'all, and I apologize for my voice. The pollen is killing me. We are back at the request of Commissioner Flowers and all of you at our goals workshop to discuss more in depth our substandard nuisance abatement program. We have spent a lot of time the last few weeks and months trying to get this together so we can sort of update y'all on where we are now, because what we realized is we're a long way from where we were when I started with this in 2011, I think it was, so 10 years ago. Just as a quick reminder, when a structure can be declared nuisance, if it's constructed or maintained in violation of applicable codes enforced in the city, if it's unfit for human habitation or commercial, industrial, or business use or occupancy due to inadequate provisions for ventilation, light, air, sanitation, or open spaces, if it poses an imminent harm because of fire, flood, hurricane, or other natural catastrophe, if it is vacant and used in the commission of drug crimes, if it is occupied and used repeatedly for the commission of illegal activities, including facilitating organized crime or criminal enterprises after written notice to the owner of such activities conducted therein, if it is abandoned, or otherwise constitutes an endangerment to the public health or safety as a result of unsanitary or unsafe conditions. I hope from those you realize that there's a few that are pretty general, and we do use those a good bit, but what we have found recently is we're really needing to use some of the ones that are a little bit more specific and for which there are not a lot of case law in this area. So when we have a nuisance structure, we have a few different ways that we can fix it, not necessarily just demolition. We have local ordinances that we can enforce. Chapter 22, of course, is our buildings and building regulation. Article 4 is unfit buildings and structures. I did provide you with a copy of that so that you would have it in case we need to flip back and forth. Chapter 42 is nuisances in general. What we've learned lately is a lot of attorneys that are trying to now handle these cases uses this very general nuisance section in the state code, and they don't realize that there's an unfit buildings and structures section specific to nuisance structures. So we get a lot of arguments about general nuisance versus the in-rim unfit buildings nuisance. And then chapter 54 is health and sanitation. All of those can be written as citations, but if we want to go through the process of demolition and actually possibly getting some of our money back from that lien, we do have to go through a complaint in rem in municipal court under chapter 22. We also enforce international codes, some of which we're required to enforce. They're mandatory from the Department of Community Affairs, and some of which are permissive, and we have elected to enforce those here. The one that we probably use the most common is the International Property Maintenance Code, International Building Code and Residential Code, and the International Plumbing, Mechanical, Fuel, Gas Code, as well as the National Electric Code. Another thing that we really have not capitalized on until recently is some of the community outreach and programs that we should be using to abate nuisances in the community with the Land Bank Authority, the Housing Authority, and of course the CHIP grant money that we've had for some time. As a quick review, this has been on y'all's list, I think, since 2011, when you allocated $100,000 a year in your general fund to combat this problem. So for the last 2 years, your specific goals in this regard have been to collaborate with partners to demolish 20 nuisance structures, either abate those through rehabilitation, donations, and or acquisition, and also to establish a tenant complaint process with the Housing Authority. We have done both of those things within that year, and so we felt as though we met our goal. In 2020, our goal was to demolish 50 nuisance structures and have 50 more in the court process. And that ironically was a goal set by Dr. Keller, who has nothing to do with this. I found that very interesting. So we didn't make that. We did demolish 37, and we probably have close to 40 ready for court, if not more. So we think we did pretty well with court being closed for a few months. We also wanted to work on tenant education in the poverty task force. They didn't really get to meet a lot last year, so we don't feel like we were able to do that. And although we are educating tenants constantly, it seems to be a battle that we are losing, even with the help of the housing authority. So that's something that we continually want to work on. Our demo permits that we've issued, I'm sorry, it's a little bit blurry, but for the last, since 2008, we have issued 658 demolition permits. And we divided those out by the city of Griffin, the land bank, the housing authority, and then private property owners that have come in and been willing to do that as well. The number of units demolished is 927. So there's a big jump. There's a difference because if you just have to pull one permit for an apartment complex, you're counting more units than you are an actual permit being pulled. So some of those account for units that were done from the housing authority. So they have actually replaced, and this is important and something that we really have not looked at before now, but they have replaced 238 of those units. So 927, we've got 238 back, 84 at the Oaks, 84 at the Iris, and 70 at the Terraces. We've also rehabilitated 201 total units. That, again, is in huge part from the housing authority with 80 at Fairmont Homes that are almost done and 50 at Nine Oaks. Nuisance units, we did not actually keep count of those that were rehabilitated that were nuisance until 2017. And since that time, there's been 71. So there's been a handful more than that. But back before 2017, we really weren't dealing with any properties that could be rehabilitated. So there's probably not much more than 71. So 201 rehabilitated. Oh, I'm missing a slide. Oh, no. Okay, this is what this looks like. When you have something that's rehabilitated through nuisance abatement, it really can go well. This is on West Poplar Street. This is a house that we were bound and determined needed to be torn down. We had a property owner come in and say, I want to fix it and I'll sell it and I'll sell it to an owner occupant, and he did, and it's gorgeous, and we've worked with him some since then, and it sold for $170,000 in the 500 block of Poplar. However, Brett and I fought this tooth and nail in court saying this does not need to be rehabbed, it needs to be torn down. Unfortunately, the judge disagreed with us, and so in 2017-ish, this was rehabbed, and this is what it looks like today. We're right back to where we were, because what happened is the owner here decided to look at this as a business and only did the absolute bare minimum, which is all we can require, bring it up to minimum standard codes, and that's what he did. So we are back to cinder block structure, boarded up windows, trash everywhere. We don't know what the insides look like because we can't go in without an administrative search warrant, but we know that there are some issues already just from the outside, and that's only been a couple of years since he's been done.
What's that address?
It's Thurman Street.
Thurman.
Thurman.
We have also replaced units that have been torn down by new housing starts. Since 2007, we've had 413. Of course, you can see the last 3 years, 2018 with 91, 2019 with 87, and 2020 with 185. We've really done a good job in getting units replaced in the last couple of years. But even if you add up new housing starts, rehab units, as well as just brand new units from the housing authority, we're still short over 200 units. So we've torn down more than we've replaced, and that becomes an issue. So other issues that we need to address that we think are getting to be a little bit problematic for us are occupied residences, apartment complexes, criminal nuisance issues, bankruptcies, appeals, nuisance lots, and then of course the big issue is going to be funding after April of next year. So what I wanted to do is show you all something that is ironically very fresh for us. This is an incident report that was written by a police officer on March 13th, 2021, so Saturday before last. He was called to a residence because there was a dispute in process. When he got there, he thought he was walking into a duplex. Instead, he walked into a duplex that was divided into 12 rooms. Each side had a kitchen, bathroom, foyer, and 3 bedrooms. The rooms were separated by plywood and joined at the kitchens, very shoddily joined at the kitchen. 3 people in some rooms were paying $550 per room per month. And the tenant that was on the lease with the landlord who was out of town was paying $700 a month for the entire property. So he was making a fortune. He had extension cords, electrical wires, PVC pipe, and water hoses running from the main structure to an old RV that he was living in on cinder blocks at the rear of the property. There was a propane tank connected and hooked up to the old tank on the RV, which was running off of vehicle batteries. So fire is a little concerned about this at this stage. And there's holes drilled in the RV with wires and hoses running in and out of the RV to the house, back and forth. Police officer showed up just because there was a dispute amongst a couple people living there. And that's what he walked up to, and then that's what he found. So what we're learning is we have a lot of people, and I think we've known this for a while, we have a lot of people living in things that they should not be living in. Our problem here is, well, several, but first, if you're going to run a boarding home, you have to do that with an occupational tax certificate in the city of Griffin, and you have to meet all different kinds of codes to do that. We don't think his landlord knew that he was running a boarding house. He also, you're not allowed to have an RV in the city of Griffin and live in it. You can't have a mobile home or an RV. He's got all kinds of work that he's done in subdividing the structure without any kind of permits. We don't know how it was done. The police officer notices that it's bad, so I can only imagine what Mr. Haynes is gonna say when he walks in. Unfortunately, we can't go in yet. We weren't called that day. It was a Saturday afternoon. So we're gonna have to go to court and ask for an administrative search warrant, which we haven't been able to do yet. So we have people that are living like this in a highly populated area of our community. You also look at these houses, they don't look to be problematic. The one on the left is actually a criminal nuisance that we sent. If it's a criminal nuisance and it's occupied, you have to send them notice that they need to stop their criminal nuisance. We did that, I think, in 3 instances. One of them, or 2 of them immediately evicted their tenants. That took care of the nuisance, we were done. There's another one that has not done anything. And so now the question is, what do? We can't demolish the structure just because it's ongoing criminal activity. We can cite them every day. But then that might get in the way of something Chief Yates is doing or the DA is doing. I'm not sure. So then we have a situation that are we involved with law enforcement? Do we need to step back and not do anything? Chad has his name on a sheet of paper that we're not sure what we're supposed to do after that. So that's something that we need to address as well. The one on the right started with numerous Ipmc violations, which is our International Property Maintenance Code. Normally, that's our first step in dealing with nuisance properties. If we can get them to go ahead and start working on it and fixing it up just with those kind of violations, and it doesn't make it to nuisance where we're having to revoke a certificate of occupancy. But very often, we are still having to go through the nuisance abatement process because they don't do anything with it. The second thing, and we talked about this before, apartments are a huge, huge issue. And there's not really a lot of guidelines as to what to do with them. This is a current apartment in the city of Griffin that someone is living in with 3 or 4 or 5 kids. Mr. Choi's here from the Housing Authority, so he helped us with this one. That's sewage. That's back up into their apartment. And that's water. You can't even see the floor in the kitchen because it's all backed up. And somebody's living like that. And that, you can barely see that. That's a tub filled with groundwater. So we have lots of issues with apartments. We have an evidence issue. If we don't know about it, if they don't go to the housing authority and say, hey, I have a tenant complaint, what do I do? And they allow Troy to go in and do any kind of inspection, then we can't do anything until we come to court and ask for administrative search warrant. Then we have a service issue. A lot of these apartment complexes are owned by out-of-town landlords as far as Canada. We have one that was in Israel at one time. So you can't serve them to tell them that you're gonna do this. And if you try and serve maybe even just the apartment, people move in and out of them so frequently that you may not have served the actual person that you're going to walk in on that day. You have a substandard issue, and this is really my biggest concern at this point. We've done a lot of inspections at a couple of different apartment complexes, and there may be 6 units in a building, and 2 of them, the certificate of occupancy needs to be revoked. Nobody needs to be living there. But if it's only 2, is the whole building a nuisance? Or is it just those 2? Because you obviously can't tear down 2 units in a 6-unit apartment building. And if there's 8 buildings and only 3 of them are substandard, does that make the whole complex substandard or just those 3 buildings? There is no case law that tells us what to do there. We also have these same issues with, here we go, criminal nuisance. Again, if somebody comes and tells us, hey, we have a criminal activity going on here, we see people in and out all hours of the day, unless they're willing to come to court and testify, which 9 times out of 10 they are not, we have no way to get an administrative search warrant for that unless we set up somebody to watch that then can come testify. Same kind of service issue there. A lot of times that might be a landlord out of town, or we don't even know who lives there, who's on the lease without doing some kind of, again, search warrant. And then the abatement issue there, I've already sort of mentioned it can't be demolished. So how do we abate the nuisance? Going through some kind of criminal action with PD and the DA. Another issue that we've run into a lot recently is bankruptcy. So what we'll have, in particular, this top one is on Melrose and the bottom one is on West Poplar, right across from the police department. We'll file a nuisance abatement petition, and we don't know until we get into court 30 or so days later that that person has filed bankruptcy. And of course, that person didn't list this property as an asset in the bankruptcy, so the bankruptcy judge doesn't know anything about it. So then we have to go to federal bankruptcy court and say, hey, this isn't worth anything. You need to release this from bankruptcy so we can get it torn down. And let me tell you how long that takes. Quite some time, because this we started with in the beginning of last year, and we still don't have any word from bankruptcy court as to whether or not we can proceed. So we just have a pending petition in municipal court that eventually, if we want to do it correctly, we would probably have to refile to make sure that we still contact all the interested parties at the time that we hear the case. Those could change in that year. So that's another issue. In the meantime, it sits. There's nothing we can do with it. Lastly, I think the one that we're having the most issues with these days are appeals. So what's happening is they're getting a court order in municipal court for demolition. They don't like it. They appeal it to Superior Court. Y'all know the one that's the most problematic, I would assume, is Roseview. I asked for a jury trial in that case. I don't know if I was entitled to one, but nobody questioned it. And I think I stand a better shot with 12 of our peers than I do with a judge. So that's what I wanted. Unfortunately, a civil jury trial may be 2 years out. So are we willing to let it continue to sit like it is? Do we waive our right to a jury trial and just say, we'll hear it by bench and just have the judge? Do we allow somebody to come in and do minimum standard code work like we had on Thurman and get back what we had in 2008 and deal with it again in 5 years? What do we do? So that is one of our biggest questions for you all. And I think one of the things that we realized we need some direction going forward, because a lot of these things that we're going to have to embark on if we're going to make a big difference are not really things that we're backed up with solid case law. So we're sort of going to forge the way here. Drew and I have been talking about this. If we want to say, here we're doing apartment complexes now, there's not many that have done it. So we're going to have to say, we think this is solid legal reasoning. So if we do get appealed, this is why we did it this way. Same thing with Roseview, but in the interim, you have them sitting like this. This is 2 on Linden and 1 on Melton. All 3 are waiting for court in Superior Court. Judges in Superior Court don't hear these cases. They don't know these cases. It's a lot like a condemnation action. They don't want to hear these cases. They don't want to know these cases. So getting it on a trial calendar with one of them is hard, as it is, much less a jury trial calendar is just not going to happen anytime soon because of our lack of jury trials. So the next thing that happens, let's say we get the house torn down after however many months, and now it's locked. And we get this, either because the owner is out of town, the owner happens to be 6 different children of a mama that's deceased, or eventually it gets to the land bank. And so we have a vacant lot that we have torn down. Land Bank got this one in 2019. So the structure was a nuisance at the time. It was abated, but what benefit does this give us? I guess I do still see that as a benefit, not having a nuisance structure. I think that's more dangerous than a nuisance lot. You have more cover to commit crime than you do on a lot. So there are still definite benefits to having a lot over a structure, but Now you've got a dumping ground. So we try and address those through code enforcement, which we issue warnings and citations as often as we can. And y'all know the struggle that we've had keeping somebody in code enforcement this year, but general cleanliness over the last 2 years, general cleanliness of margins, which is our grass, unacceptable curbside, tires, in-op vehicles, illegal dumping, and property maintenance. So those are all things that we are constantly citing for within our code. But again, if it's the land bank's lot and we cite the land bank, guess who's really paying that operationally? We are. And then, or the land bank comes back and says, well, we don't own it yet because we have not foreclosed that right to redeem. We need to go after the previous property owner that let it go to tax sale. Well, if they didn't come to court when I was gonna tear their house down, I'm pretty sure they're not gonna come to court for $150 fine. So that's not very helpful either. Our last issue is funding. We passed our SPOS in 2016, and I'm sure y'all remember that was $500,000 per year for acquisition, abatement, demolition, and disposal of existing substandard improvements to real property. That's been very helpful. I feel like we've been able to accomplish a lot since then, but that runs out in April of 2022, which is a year away. So that would actually be within this next fiscal year's budget, which means now is the time to decide what we're going to do with the budget. We used to allocate $100,000 per fiscal year in general fund expense since FY10 until you were able to remove it with that passage of SPOS. So we do have some excess funds built up in that account that we could cover between April and June of next year. But it is something that we need to be thinking about because 500,000 back to 100,000 is a big step backwards. And that, right now I think having somebody else come in and start handling these is the time to sort of let them know this is how we're going moving forward. So that's the question. Where do we go from here? Do we think that we're making an impact at all by tearing down 37 houses a year? Do we want to concentrate on occupied structures? And if that's the case, do we want to concentrate on just single family ones as we go or apartment complexes? Do we want to continue with the spot nuisance or focus on a specific area? If you'll remember, I think it was 2014, before I actually joined the staff of the city, I was asked to be on the code enforcement task force with Captain Keith Daniel, that concentrated in the Spring Hill Park District. And so we spent all of our time for about 4 or 5 months in Spring Hill. We cited everything we could, we got every house we could, we did everything we could in that area. And we're almost to where we have a completely marketable area. We've got a few houses left that will have to be condemned. But that was 2014, that was 7 years ago. So if we want to make that kind of change where we pick an area and say, look, there's a lot of development going on at Fairmont or a lot of development that could occur at DF Fuller and Edgewood because we have a lot of control of that area, let's concentrate all of our effort there. We don't care whether or not it's an occupied structure. We don't care if it's an apartment complex. Is that a better way to make a bigger difference? What is our primary goal for demolition? We've said over and over and over, we got to get rid of this stuff. But at the same time, people have to have a place to live. So how do we make sure that we have that balance where we have something, if it can be rehabbed, that we're allowing the people to rehab it? And Brett and I sometimes disagree about that, but we had one recently where a guy from Covington came down. He bought a property on Melrose, which is right across from the fire station. He has since fixed up a property on Palace and did a good job, got a CO. Brett did sort of have to walk him through it, holding his hand, but he did it and did a great job. So we're willing to work with people that we know are going to do that. That's looking at stuff a lot more on a case-by-case basis and not just coming in here like I used to with 10 cases, 20 minutes later, I've got 10 demolition orders and I'm out the door. We can't do that anymore. And that's a good thing because that means the worst of the worst we've taken care of. Of course, there's going to be something that comes up every once in a while, like a fire on Meriwether Street, where she, for some reason, didn't think she needed to tear that down, but the whole thing he caved in and it was just the front of the house. So that's got to go. But there's some other issues that may give us a little bit more expectations for that area or more ability to develop. But we sort of need to know what y'all want us to do because we've got a few left that we can keep going like we have been. Or we can sort of change direction and start looking at something else.
Do you,
Yes.
you mentioned SPOS funds. Have you got an estimate of, based on the current income pattern, our projects that we have to pay off?
I
Some
do,
estimates of what, because from what I remember, the county, they're not planning to probably do a SPOS this year. So will we have another 500,000 in excess to about to $1 million?
as of Friday, Mr. Olmsted told me that we had about 1.3 million left. But that has not been, that's on an audited number, not coming from Marcus, so, but that's, April 2022 would be our last 6 years of collection, so that's where we are.
1.3 million for substandard housing, or is that for total,
For blight,
for blight? We haven't used $500,000 every year
no.
at this point, so we've got some.
And I think that includes possibly the payback from Historic City Hall, so I don't know if that's occurred yet or not either.
So the 1.3 million is what we have as of today, but we still have another basic year to collect.
Mr.
We
Schwab's
got
still here.
a SPOS project, but I guess trying to figure out what would be available. once bonds are paid off and everything is done, where we stand, that would give us a picture of what could be available.
Right, either around 1.3 or 1.8, depending on if Chuck had added that in or not, and I can't tell the way he wrote this.
Yeah, Marcus is coming up.
Just give me a few minutes to pull up those files, because we do run those reports monthly. So let me pull the latest data and confirm or corroborate what Chuck has provided.
So me personally, I like to put funds towards doing what we have to keep the project, keep the process moving in terms of substandard house removal, in terms of Rosewood or Roadview. I don't want to step backwards on those, and settle for something.
That was my comment on Rotary, going to state courts and go to court. It's 2 years. We don't need to keep ending up with the same thing. And I think this traditionally, what people have relied on is that we're going to settle for the minimum here in our community. And most of us are just going to ride back and just say that's the way that it's always been. And I think the only way we ever get from that is that we step up and let them know that it's not going to be that way any longer. And what if it means it's 2 years out, and it's 2 years out. And we'll handle it in two years and be here before you know it.
And just so y'all are aware, we do get calls a good bit about Roseview, Chad in particular, probably once a week from developers. Most of the time have never seen it. They just see it listed on something and they're in California and they see that this rental income with 42 units at $400 a month, of course, is worth the investment. And what I tell them when they talk to me is, well, if you can't put anybody in it, then I don't care how many units it is, 42, 50, 100 times 0 is 0. So it's not worth anything to you or to me as of today, because you're not putting anybody back in that the way it is. They had gotten to where it was almost, one side was almost done. And then that's when they didn't meet their time frame and it was appealed. Everything has since been stripped out. There's not light bulbs left in it. It's worse than when we started in
Stripped out
2017.
by,
Vandals.
okay,
We now have a relationship with the attorney that represents the capital partner group that's out of New York. And I do call him frequently and say, look, you got to get somebody down here to clean this up. They have gated the front of it, well, not really gated it, just put a little chain across it and barred it. They boarded everything back up. So that should stop, but it doesn't, that's still nuisance.
And it's right across from one of our.
Right across from the
school
school.
system, our
Like
elementary school, which is,
I went to that school and never changed.
No, it's never changed. But we have told developers, bring us your idea, and then maybe we can go to Superior Court with a consent agreement saying that we'll give you the opportunity to rehabilitate it. But all of them want to do the bare minimum, and we're not interested in cinder block walls and exposed piping and everything else anymore. So until they are willing to do something more than that, we're not willing to negotiate. We do also sort of have a good place to stand at this point with that being a very nice lot, with it being across from the school. We could go in if we do get to demolish it, and if we don't get that money back, first of all, we think we can use that cinder block for road at the landfill, so our disposal cost is what waiting on. Which I have told the attorney too, with the capital brief, we'll take your cinder block for free, that's half your cost at least, because that's gonna be a lot of weight if you have to dispose of it. They still have no interest, but if we get to do it, we'll take it, use it for the road, so the cost that we're just paying at that point is our public works department for the time and the equipment spent to do that. We can lien the property when they don't, either they pay the lien and they can have the property, or they don't, we foreclose our lien and then we own the property. So that's an option as well.
I think Marcus has some information he'd like to share with you.
Okay, so I have, the question of the $1.3 million, I'm trying to pull up one more report that will shed a little bit more light on these numbers. The 1.3, I'm not sure where Chuck got the number from or how we corroborated that. But in the bank account for SPLOST 2009, okay, we have two SPLOST accounts. We have an 09 SPLOST that's running out, and then we have the SPLOST 320, the 2016 SPLOST. The 09, there's about 500,000 left, 600,000 for transportation.
Already spent for
Right.
LCI.
Okay. And the other part. All right. So on the spreadsheet that I have every month, that you get every month, it shows that we collected now at this point, we have in for blight available $539,000 worth of funds. We'll add to that another 500 next year. So that'll give you $1 million. The question was whether or not the overage was already pulled from Historic City Hall. We already pulled from blight. I have that number right here. Add that together. We pulled roughly $750,000 out of the blight program to cover the overages at City Hall. And that is through last year. So we need to gather the current numbers for Historic City Hall and identify what that incremental difference would be, and we would add that to the 756 that was pulled out. So that money would be diverted from blight to the Historic City Hall program. So the $1 million or so that's available today, or the 540,000 that's available today, is already net of the Historic City Hall numbers, and then there's the additional 500 coming in next year. And this covers bond payments and all that stuff.
But right now, the revenue projections are greater than the original
They're-
number. So
they're-
what we need to figure out is where we're going to estimate at the end of the day. At some point. So we-
The trending is upwards, okay, and we're seeing a positive contribution to the SPLOST program. And I think, Brant, you may be able to comment on this. You've repositioned some projects to the end or the latter part of
We're holding
program.
about 4 million sitting in there right now.
so we're holding off on some projects until we come up with more definitive numbers.
But we should have $500,000 for this coming budget year without any issue.
So
For the blight program, yes,
For the light program.
that's
So we should at
programmed.
least-
That is already programmed, yes. The pay-go component is the part that goes up and down, and that's the part that's reserved for transportation.
So safely at this point, what we can say is we have $1 million left with what we have in the bank and what we assume we will collect. We know that that's what we do have.
Correct.
Fund 2022 budget year, 2023 budget.
Right, and that will give you the $3 million that was allotted over the six-year period at $500,000 a year.
And hopefully the county will get their projects done and we'll just blast vote and then we can. at some point.
Jessica, can I ask you one quick question about the criminal nuisance abatement? That's kind of new to us. Do we have any way to estimate what the cost would be for those? Or is it just primarily with our resources and labor?
Well, we can't tear down a house just because it's being used criminally. All we could do is cite under that code
So we're
section.
really not looking at any cash outlay for those.
No.
The community kind of drives us dealing with those. One of those things can take over a whole block. So I don't know that we can figure that into the calendar of what we're gonna do either. Have we done any yet?
We've sent 3 letters. 2 of them took it upon themselves to evict the people that were in there. One has not, and I'm
That's what we're working.
meeting, you know.
So looking at, in terms of the code, existing occupied investment property, or it could be owner occupied, that are in shameful condition. Right now, how is the housing authority relationship? Are we getting many reports from the housing authority in regards to tenant complaints?
We
Do we
do.
need to do better? We need to do a
Right
better
now, a
job
lot
of
of them-
marketing that issue so that people that have problems can actually
Do y'all want to speak?
know how to file a complaint.
Pretty much anytime that somebody comes in to make a tenant complaint, the first place we're gonna send them is gonna be the housing authority, for a couple of reasons, obviously, so that they can document it. The housing authority can kind of teach them what their rights are too with respect to, you know, making that complaint. And then we move forward from there. Once they've kind of made contact with the housing authority, then we'll get Mr. Haynes involved as well, you know, after, Troy has done an inspection as well.
And once we, how often has it been that there's an issue in regards to the resident being the problem versus the property owner? In terms of clean, you know, housekeeping standards.
It's kind of more often than not, it's the property owner. From what I've seen in the year that I've been here. So it's not to say that, you know, sometimes the tenant doesn't create, you know, issues as well, but the far-reaching issues is usually going to be lack of maintenance and things of that nature from the property.
And I think the problem that we've run into lately, and Troy can talk about this more than I could, is most of the tenant complaints are coming from apartment complexes.
Yes.
So it's not single-family structures where we can just walk in and say, you've got a problem. And then again, don't forget, we have our Relocation Act, that's a federal act, that if we say you can't be there anymore and it's owner-occupied, we're responsible for putting them wherever. If
it's owner-occupied.
if it's owner-occupied, if it's landlord-tenant, the landlord is. But just understand as well, that doesn't happen very often.
And I would like to add to that too, because when we were dealing with some issues with respect to, you know, tenants at apartment complexes around Christmas time too, where obviously the owner is responsible for moving them into another unit. Well, another issue that we dealt with, especially if it was something that you're dealing with, like we were like a day or two before like temperatures getting really cold and things of that nature, they're trying to go from one unit to another. They still have to set up, you know, contracts with, you know, customer service, you know, to even get the power turned on. So there's other issues that kind of, it's not just as simple as moving them from this unit to this unit, boom, it's fixed. There's a lot of things that kind of play into that as well.
And in the case of Roseview, if you'll remember, we didn't even have an option to move them anywhere else. They couldn't be in any of those 42 units. So at the time, that owner was supposed to put people wherever he could. And from what I remember, I think maybe 2 people didn't have anywhere else to go, and he paid for their hotel room for 3 days. Technically, that should still be taking place now because he hasn't fixed it, and they can't go back in.
So looking at your issues to address, I guess you were asking, I think it was the direction from this board. So
Yes.
in regards to occupied residences, let's just take one each at a time, if we have time. What is staff's recommendation, or what direction would you like to be given?
Well, I guess for me, it's not really that I need to know how you want me to handle each of those things. What I need to know is, I mean, I do have some specific questions like Rosie, which I think y'all have answered with a consensus that you want us to proceed until tornado, which is great. I'm excited about that. But do you feel like if we just continue like we've been doing with either single family residents, whether occupied or vacant, that is going to make you feel when we go to our next goals workshop that we met our goal? Because 37 houses, which most of them, I think this past year were houses. So single family structures, most of them were landlord tenant. But do you feel like we have made any impact? Are you happy with that, I guess is my question. And if the answer is no, then how do we fix that?
So this is what I'll say, and I think I've said this before. I think my overarching concern is what happens after we take the structures down. I agree with you. I would much rather have an empty lot than a blighted structure on the lot. But people still live in the neighborhood and they still live on those streets. And so then we essentially created an additional issue, a new issue. I think probably all of us have gotten the calls that, hey, now the rats are coming in my house because there's no house for them. There's snakes in the grass, people coming over here dumping their trash. So that's one overarching issue I have. And in a perfect world, if there were case law, I say go after these apartments wholeheartedly. I feel like what we've done by eliminating the worst of the worst is force people to go to like one notch above the worst of the worst. And so in some way we've created a different rental market that there is nowhere else to stay. So you just gotta take whatever is available. So I mean, obviously I do want us to continue funding the program. I don't know, at this point, I think it's more layered than just the efforts that we put forth. Because the issues are more than we can handle on our own in terms of lot maintenance or some of the criminal activity that happens. I don't know that those are decisions as a board that I think we can give direction, but we can't predict how those things fall out. You know, I mean, we can say go to court, but court's not really happening right now. So we obviously, I think we continue to pursue it from a legal standpoint, but what do we do in the interim while it's 2 years at Roseview? That's still, that's still a hot mess. I had to catch myself. It's still a hot mess and people still live there. And so then my question becomes, what can we do as a board or as a city to somehow lessen the impact of the people that live around Roseview? There's a school across the street. There's two like almost neighborhoods right behind Roseview that are full of houses. So I do want us to take properties down, but I don't want us to get so caught up in we've cleared 37 structures off that we forget those structures are next to people's homes. And that when we clear them, now it's just there. Or as like the picture you showed, it's boarded up again. I don't know the answer to that, but I don't want us to get so caught up in a spreadsheet of accomplishment that we say, oh, well, it's okay, we knocked down 37 houses, and we forget that that's 37 gaps that we've created in neighborhoods that's largely unmaintained. I mean,
Correct.
And what I'm hoping is at some point we get the critical mass enough that empowers folks to see the value of reinvesting into these areas. But with building prices where they're at in terms of materials, 1,300 square foot house is going to be over $100,000. And can you get what comes first?
If they want to build in Griffin, then that's what they're going to do.
Right, but there's that cost to build in Griffin,
And that's
to build owner occupied.
And that's
So how do we?
That's the direction we want to go in.
How do we get those? How do we set up incentives?
Tell them that's the direction we want to go in. If you want to build in Griffin, your starting price at building a house, a 1,300 square foot house is going to be $100,000. If you don't come here, that's what we expect. The people that are already here, that's what, we have to raise those expectations. I'm not caught up on the numbers. I'm not going to accuse the staff, me personally, of not meeting any goals because you're rushing to tear down 37 houses and the community is going to, in the word that Florida often cuss, is making the community look bad. What I want to do is make sure we continue to fund what you guys are doing to keep the effort going, to start to establish a plan when we do tear these places down. We need to market these lots. Let people know, hey, we got some empty lots inside of our city, and your house may be the one that starts to bring the neighborhood back up, or bring it up where it's never been before. So when we get these down, what's going back up in these places will not be the same thing. And
I guess not different from Florida, but the 37, that you said we knocked down, okay. Most of those houses, I think the majority of them, all were unoccupied,
Yes.
but they were unoccupied. Okay, and my issue has been for a long time that we have houses that are occupied that are worse than the ones that we've knocked down. That's where I would like to really focus on occupied, substandard or dilapidated occupied houses. Because when you go into these neighborhoods and you knock these houses down, you have a vacant lot. You got a vacant lot, you got a house next door that's dilapidated, and it's full of junk in the backyard, all around the side of the house, and everybody can see it. That's not appealing to any investor that's coming to, I wouldn't invest in it. So I think that's where I go, whether it's owner occupied, and maybe if it's owner occupied, we can maybe try to look to where we might be able to offer something, some operation that would help them. But it's a difference in being dilapidated and being nasty. So that's where I think code enforcement, we need to focus on that. You know, it's just, I mean, you got people in neighborhoods that's living in dilapidated houses that's running a garage out of their yard. Out of their yard, you know, and we drive right by it and we don't say anything. You got people that's running a garage that's paying taxes and doing everything they need to do. But these people living in these houses, and you got 10, 11 junk cars in the backyard, and what you call it, plastic things covering makeshift garages and stuff. And we don't say anything, we just ride right by it, you know. And in the past, we've asked police officers to look at stuff. But, you know, and I know code enforcement can't do it all, but the majority of these houses that are like that are occupied.
So let me ask a question. You showed the pictures of the occupied apartment. What was the resolution to that? Did the person stay in the apartment? Did they, like, what happened?
Generally, when we have a problem that's that is that bad, the housing authority will transfer it over to us. We get code enforcement and myself involved. We give them, in a situation like that, obviously, we'd say fix it in 24 hours, otherwise they can't live here or something like that. That's a situation where that one was resolved. But that's just one tenant who came to us. Now, yes, that was a disgusting problem with sewage backup issues, but just as we found in administrative search warrant and other apartments, there might be 3 more cases like that in the same building, and these people have never even come to the housing authority. They've never come to us. They don't, not that they don't understand, but they live in this and they pay $900 a month for these places, but they don't come to us, so we don't know the problem exists.
Is there some mechanism of like community engagement that would empower us more? Do we need to go knock door to door?
Well, that's generally what happens. In one of our apartment complexes, we did an administrative search warrant and we were given a search warrant for the entire complex because we had so many different complaints throughout the different buildings that the judge felt like that was enough to say you can go wherever. It wasn't concentrated to one building, and that was our argument for the search warrant. Once we got out there and started knocking on doors, we were in building A, and building Z knew what we were doing and wanted to know, how can you help? And I mean, come get me and let me take you over here to show you this. So it doesn't take but coming out there one time and saying, here's why we're here. The problem then becomes that same thing that we did in July of last year, was that? I hear from the female in building A about once a week, and there's not been hardly anything I can do for her. It's a property maintenance violation. We've cited the owner. We've asked him to tear down the single family structure in the front. He still hasn't done that. I mean, he has a court order. I shouldn't say we asked. He's ordered to tear it down. And if he doesn't very soon, we will be. But when it's not quite that bad, or we don't know if we can deem that one a nuisance because the rest of the building isn't as bad. I mean, she's not living without a front door. No front door on her apartment.
Mhm.
And you've got this guy that's in New Hampshire, he doesn't care. She pays him $900 a month. What does he care?
You mean, no door, period?
No door.
And
She has
still
one, she has one on her unit, not on the front of the building,
Yes,
Oh,
which is
okay.
still open to everything.
but the building's open.
In regards to the lots that we have liens on, do we have an estimate to try to get that critical mass? I mean, what it would cost to
I don't,
file for foreclosure on that property based on the liens that are owed, that we could then amass a certain group of them to be able to market through the land bank's ownership, house authority?
it's never been worthwhile
A lot of those
because,
liens are probably totally worthless.
Yeah.
We at one point, we started this program many years ago, back in the 1980s, tried to get the liens, we take it to the sheriff, who has, by law, has to conduct a sheriff sale on a monthly basis. Nobody would bid on the properties. Many of them were the so-called heir, H-E-I-R properties, where they maybe had passed down 2 or 3 generations. I dealt with a matter in Sonoy, I guess year before last, where they're building a new shopping center. And there was a piece of property nobody seemed to know the ownership of. And we got to looking at it. The property was deeded in 1916 to a gentleman who, through his granddaughter, continued to live on the property before she in turn, and this is based purely on hearsay, moved to Atlanta and just abandoned the property. Nobody had paid taxes on it, to Coweta County or to the city for many years. It just sat there and nobody did anything with it because they didn't know what to do with it, basically.
What I'm asking is, I don't want to reason why we can't do it. I'm trying to ask reasons. How do we do it if we wanted to get possession? Whether we're trying to get
The
the land bank
theory of the law
authority.
is just like with tax sales, that you sell the lien.
But if it said that we asked for a sheriff's sale, whether the city gets it or the land bank authority,
Well,
you have clear title on it at that
judgment
point.
liens, so they don't go, if they don't sell, they don't go to the land bank authority. What happens is the sheriff does what's called a nulla bona, which is the Latin phrase for it did not sell, and gives it back to the lien holder. You can come back again later, or you can take it to another, if you find property of that judgment debtor in another county or another state, you can domesticate the lien there and try to collect there. But, we're not the property holding state that we were 200 years ago when these laws were grown up and passed. And, back in those days, people had property that you could levy against, but that's just not so today. We're far more mobile. People move around and, if they don't do what they're supposed to do, we wind up with these uncollectible judgments.
So does the legislation need to be pursued?
We have tried for years to do something. There was a story one day last week on one of the news channels out of Atlanta dealing with the tax collection process and the sale of the tax FIFAs, which you all have dealt with for years. You know the problems there. And there's been some bills introduced which haven't moved to go anywhere in the General Assembly.
But right now, once the land bank authority or anybody buys a tax delinquent property, there's a 13-month or 12-month right of redemption period. And once you get through that process, they advertise, they have a clear title.
They do not have
If
clear
they go
title.
through the proper steps, yes, that can take good time.
Right, but our land bank authority does not do that. They foreclose the right to redeem, which is part of the way they open. They cannot warrant clear title because they don't go through a quiet title action in Superior Court. So they do sort of half of it, and then if you want it, you gonna have to do the quiet title action. They don't do that part.
So to get to the quiet title, so that we can get possession of the property, so that we can then.
You have possession once you go through the foreclosure of the right of redemption. It's just that you don't know who's gonna come back and say, well, you didn't foreclose against me and I had some action in it. So it's just sort of a,
So how much is the quiet title process so that you do have?
it just depends on the attorney. I don't know how much Ms. Wyndham would charge at this point, but the land bank doesn't feel like it's
You
beneficial to
probably
you.
would run into costs somewhere around $1,500, $2,000 per case, I would think.
I have a question. Okay, when the we originally came up with the land bank, we were looking at Macon and they were redeveloping and everything. So what happened to that? You know, that was what I thought the land bank would be, the conduit to redevelopment. So the land bank does not, once they get the properties, that's it.
That's how they've operated so far. I don't think that they had any kind of strategy when they started acquiring properties at the beginning, back in '08. They've tried to be a little bit more cognizant of what's where and what they already own, and is this something that we actually need to acquire and not just we want it because nobody else bid on it. However, I don't see any kind of.
I'm trying to figure out a strategy though for us so that we can move these unoccupied, unused properties, at least where we can market them.
I don't, you know,
Whether
and I
we
didn't.
bundle together and say to a developer, say, if you build owner occupied homes, we've got these units.
I showed you all the map last time, and I apologize, I don't have it with me on the slide this time, but there's not many areas where there is that critical mass. I would say the D.F. Fuller Edgewood area is one of them, except there's one private property owner there on Edgewood that has 5 or 6 houses. So that D.F. Fuller, West College, right there would be a great spot. But that's land bank, that's also the Griffin Area Land Trust. That's some of us from Edgewood. So you could, to me, that's probably the most critical mass that we have. So if you wanted to try something like that, my suggestion would be that we need to look everywhere else around here, see what else is dilapidated, whether occupied or not. That's also Avon Park, apartments are right there, which is the old Regency. So I really don't think there's any need to do anything there unless you're willing to deal with Avon Park.
So let me ask my question real quick. Honest answers for the 3 of you. No cheating. If you had a blank check for $1 million, what are you going after in terms of this entire thing, right? Because you all are looking at it from your own unique vantage point. So no, you cannot collaborate.
No, I said I'll let them go first. I have nothing.
I'll let you first.
Yeah.
I mean, the biggest concern that I have right now, and again, let's say there was case law there and all that, the apartments are the big concern for me right now.
Okay.
Because it's a massive density that's kind of there in one spot. It's, as far as like tenant complaints, that's what we're seeing the most of right now. So we're a pretty well oiled machine as it deals with, single family residential structures. That's the thing that concerns me. And then you've got opportunity, you remove 40 units, 80 units, whatever, but you need to replace those units, with something else. It provides some opportunity. So that's kind of what I see.
Okay.
When,
Let them finish the answer.
Excuse me.
I would say my answer is 2 parts. First part, I agree with Chad, the apartments. The biggest concern I have with that, obviously, we have Griffin residents living in deplorable conditions. And they're paying $900, sometimes $1,200 for these two-bedroom apartments that just with terrible conditions. But that brings back the question of, obviously, in Roseview, it falls on the Georgia landlord-tenant law. That person that is letting these residents live in those deplorable conditions, can we rely on them to put these individuals up in hotels when we placard the entire complex? Or, Roseview was 42 some odd, maybe legal, unlegal units. Appleton, for instance, is in excess of 80. And these are predominantly families rather than individuals, so that's something we have to consider with, as O'Connor stated, is when we declare that a unit is unfit, does that just mean that that unit is unfit, or does that mean that that building that unit is in is unfit, or are we just saying the entire complex is unfit? Because then y'all will start to get calls, we'll be dealing with all those tenants coming to us because that landlord, this out-of-town landlord, is not going to put them up.
Again, piggybacking off that, like I said earlier, even if they move from this unit to that unit, that landlord still has to give them a lease, so then that way they can go turn on their lights.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just not simply moving them from one location to another. There's a lot to it that you've got to work with that landlord, and if they're already difficult to work with, then the tenant's the one who's hung up in the middle of it, and it makes it very difficult.
You're saying, okay, y'all can't get the landlord to come do anything, pretty much.
That becomes a civil matter between the landlord and the tenant. Once it's different if it was a homeowner, that makes us responsible as a city to do it, but with the landlord owning the property, that makes them responsible for taking care of the tenant that has that lease. We can put them in contact with the housing authority, Salvation Army, and places like that, but at the end of the day, it's a civil matter between the tenant and the landlord for that housing.
But in this instance, the landlord at Appleton is in New Hampshire. He also is very litigious. He believes he's an attorney, so anything that we tell him, he fights. There is absolutely nothing that we can say that he is just gonna do.
Who do they pay their rent to?
Yeah, I think he comes down every month, doesn't he?
Either him or I think his stepdaughter's involved now, so I'm going
The
Maintenance man.
The maintenance man that don't do nothing to the apartment,
Mhm.
collect the rent. Okay, and in the housing authority, they have this thing where if you're living in a substandard condition, you can withhold your rent. It's certain stipulations you have to do.
Mhm.
But do they know that? Do the residents know that?
We try to inform them, they can put their rent into an escrow account, but there's not enough knowledge of the escrow account for the tenants to understand it. And that they had to go to the bank and open up their own escrow account. So we don't have the escrow account through the housing authority.
Some of these tenants, they don't even have a bank. They wouldn't know where to go to the bank or how to open an account. So it's not as easy as I would know, okay, I'm gonna go to my bank and say, open an escrow account, I'll put this money in there. But that's not something, there's so much education that needs to be done. I don't know who or how or where we start.
We try to inform them that they can open up an escrow account, and they say, well, how do I do it? I'm like, you're gonna have to go to United Bank, you're gonna have to go and ask them and see what the proper channels is to go through.
And even with that, they may not be able to open,
And they
Knowing
don't,
that
they don't
they
know
don't
how.
not knowing what their banking condition is.
Well, so I guess my question to that though, well, first, tell me what you would do with $1 million before I get.
Well, Roseview has been my little pet child at this point, so I really want to see it gone. But really, it's apartment complexes in general. I think that makes a bigger difference. If I'm sitting there looking at Versailles or Appleton, every time I drive to Kroger, if that were a nice place to live like it used to be, that would be a huge difference very quickly. But that means pretty much we're gonna have to just figure out how to do that.
Yeah.
So,
I don't understand.
that one actually was above the Appleton in our order of priority until Appleton went to.
So then let me ask you this, of the thing that she brought
It's a
up.
hot mess.
Even though, there are tools in place and there's this education gap, is that something that we can somehow facilitate if it gives us any power in this discussion about the apartment complex? If we're saying there's no case law, we don't really know how to go forward with it, but there is some tool that exists, like, does that give us, is it worth us putting the effort in to say, let's do this education piece, let's mount an effort so that we have some bargaining with the landlord, or is it not?
I mean, we could try, but I could just foresee us going to Appleton and say, hey, we'll bring pizza tonight and you all come and we'll teach you how you need to, please don't have us kicked out of there so fast. I mean.
No, it looked like we should be able to, us and Housing Authority and the land bank should be able to get together and and figure out something.
And I know, and that, maybe there's a better way, especially now with Zoom, to do this, but in the past, we've tried some of those educational outreaches and you'll have 2 or 3 people show up. And if we can't get the majority of that apartment complex to come and understand what we need to do and how this needs to work, it's not gonna work. So I'm sure that we can.
So the owner is just not interested in trying to do anything.
No, not this one. Ava Park, we haven't really dealt with yet.
Where is
Grandiose ideas, just never
Heritage.
finish.
no, where is the owner for?
New Hampshire,
So,
for that one, for Appleton.
So I guess my thoughts about, like, in terms of how do we proceed, I think kind of piggybacking off what Chad said, we haven't tried a true formula for the single family structures. But we are getting to a place where we, like I said earlier, we've removed enough of those that now the apartment complex is where you move. So at some point, we will have to figure out how to remedy that, because we have eliminated a lot of the blighted houses that they were renting. So you have no choice but to pay the $900 because we're not putting the units back as quickly. And so, I don't know, even though I completely understand that there's no case law and it may not even be something that we can pursue, I don't know how deeply we can get into it if we're saying it's a quality of life issue, which is why we're pursuing this, and not acknowledge that you've got a cluster of people who are without what we would all consider the basic resources of living.
Well, and don't get me wrong, just because there's no case law doesn't mean you can't do it. It's just that you don't really have a framework or an idea of how it's worked before.
Right.
But that's sort of been the case with us in this kind of program anyway, with Drew and bringing it with stormwater. I mean, we haven't been scared to go ahead and say, this is how you do it, and let somebody tell us otherwise. And I think that we have argued this enough to sort of know the ins and outs of what we believe would be the appropriate way to establish that case law. It's just that that's different. So we'll have to be prepared to say, we may get sued. And I could see the guy from Appleton, if we could get a court order saying at least building A and what is it, T, something that S, we're always dealing with. Yeah, they're a nuisance and they've got to go. Well, that's 18 units. I don't think a lot of them are occupied currently, but that's 18 potential $900 a month. That's worth a lawsuit for him. So if I'm gonna have to be real comfortable saying 4 units in a building of 6 is a nuisance, and you're not willing to rehabilitate them, and I've given you every opportunity to do it, and you haven't done it, so the only option at this point is demolition. And
We can't sue him.
I mean, that's what this petition would be.
he is counting every apartment unit. You got an investment, someone started talking about taking away 3, 4, 2, or 1. I mean, it's going to affect the bottom line.
Well, I will say this, when we looked at it back in December, I think there were only about 35 units that were occupied at that point. Yeah, because there's been so many move out, so we can't live like this.
So could we potentially, like we do if a power is off for a unit for 6 months, right now currently if a single family household has power off, they'd have a life safety inspection? Could we look at doing something similar to that in regards to if 50% of a building has its power off, they have to have a life safety inspection? for the property, all the units in that building?
We do currently issue utility reconnect permits. We've even done some here lately to units that he has rehabbed. And by rehabbed, I mean he put glue on vinyl on the floors and just painted over all the stains on the walls and stuff like that. But that, when we do those inspections for utility reconnect, like you said, it's just life safety. The city also has the International Existing Building Code adopted, which if they're not doing any work in there, like removing walls or anything, it's classified as a Class 1 renovation, which we can't legally enforce them to bring it up to current code just from that aspect. So, and in that situation too, utility reconnect, we're going in there without power on, so there's no way for us to know. Good.
But we could require, to get a final permit on a home, you gotta have utilities on. And if you go to a Section 8 inspection to get a house certified, you've gotta have the power on, the gas on, to do a final inspection. Why can't we have that same type of teeth in regards to if the utilities are off for 6 months, you've gotta put everything on, make sure the plumbing's working, do everything.
Well, I think
You
what
would
he's
like to
saying
do with a
is,
CEO of a house that's more than a Class 1 then.
I think what he's saying is you could, but you can't require them to bring it up to even minimum standard code. You could just say, yeah, it works, but it's from 1972,
If
so
a
it's.
commercial building goes vacant for 6 months or whatever period, you've got to bring it up to a minimum code. Why can't we do that the same way on single-family homes? It's that way. You've got to bring it up after a certain period. Why can't we do that on apartments?
You don't have to bring it up to minimum standard code just because it's vacant. You do have to test the power and water.
That law that passed in about 2005 or 6 addressed the inspections of residential properties on sale or transfer of ownership.
It did, and you can't do it just because
You
it
said you had to have
changes.
probable cause to.
But I think vacancy for 6 months to a
We went
year
from a
would
12
be.
months to a 6 month, just like the county was. The county had some way that they're making in terms of dealing with mobile homes. So the
Well,
county had it where the
That's
vacancy for.
that's an occupational tax. That had nothing to do with codes and stuff.
Through business life.
But if a mobile home went with it, had power down for, or even a single family residence came down without power for 6 months, MAC used to come out and do a full-blown inspection, checking everything.
Correct.
Does the county still do that? And is that
Yes.
something that we could implement in
For
terms
the
of how to deal with
6 month
apartments, or
That's what they're doing, that's correct.
it's a full-blown inspection, you gotta bring up code, or you're not gonna have it?
You don't have to.
It's just a safety inspection.
Yeah, you still don't bring anything up to code. You essentially inspect to make sure the electrical is safe to be turned back on, and then you can
Smoke
use the
detectors.
property
The heating
maintenance
systems
inspection.
are vetted right, water heaters are done, have the right ventilation.
So that's the other thing, at
Could
what
we, like,
point do you draw a line
that 6
existing?
month-
What'd
That's
you
six-
say?
At what point do you draw the line between if I go into a house over here off of College or something, it's an older house that's got a water heater in there that's older than me, but it still meets code? Am I gonna say, okay, well, it met code then, but it doesn't have an expansion tank, so I'm gonna make you put an expansion tank on that? What legal avenue do I have to?
The gas company requires us to put expansion tanks and requires us to bring water heaters up to code when they turn on utilities. When the gas company comes out and light water heaters, when a tenant transfers over, they require us to put the sediment trap, they require us to put the expansion tank. I mean, they tell you what.
I mean, I can, if that's the board's pleasure, I can write a book on every utility disconnect we go to.
Well, that's what I was gonna say, is it possible that you, I guess, maybe kind of, I agree with Doug, is it possible for us to look at what we have in place and see if there's any way to tweak it, use it, to, I guess, to kind of begin the process?
Well, don't forget, you're sort of talking about two different things. We already can go in and say it's been vacant, so we're going to do an inspection and make sure that for life safety purposes, this is good to go. Nuisance abatement is that first one, if it is constructed or maintained in violation of applicable codes enforced within the city. You don't meet minimum standard code, so we revoked the CO and now you have to bring it up to code for us to give you that back.
Mhm.
That's different than a utility reconnect. We can't do that in that regard. We're just looking at life safety purposes.
Okay,
But the
That's a
house,
start, I guess,
I
but
mean,
it's
the house
not
is
that.
peeling, the house has got peeling paint, window panes are falling out. I mean, at what point,
We already don't allow power if that's the case, because the city does have the Ipmc adopted, so if that's the case, we will require that to
so
be
that's what
done.
I'm saying, that we make sure that anytime the unit stays vacant 6 months, it automatically kicks in and we're gonna go in.
Let me go back and look and see when we changed that exactly how we worded it and see if it either addresses it now that would apply to a unit in the apartment complex, or if we need to make that more clear. I think we can add that. Well,
I don't know. I mean, this, I would like to, continue, going towards the apartments. But I don't know what that actually looks like from a staff perspective, or how that works, or where the collaboration lies between us and perhaps the housing authority and wherever else. But I also don't know how that, I don't know if we just completely turn away from like the single family structures. Like obviously, like you said, there are going to be some that still require coming down. Or do we then say, put more effort on rehab? And it's so multi-layered, I'm just not really sure. But it does sound like, based on what you guys are saying, the people who do it every day, that the apartment complexes are what you are seeing now blossoming as the larger problem. So I don't want us to turn a blind eye to that, knowing that if we don't do it this year, next year or the year after that, we'll be in worse shape when we could have already tried to start doing something. I don't know where the sweet spot is.
And we don't either. That's why we sort of wanted to make sure that whatever we agree upon, everybody has had the opportunity to say, yeah, this is sort of what I want. We have a consensus from you all, because obviously if we have one like we did on the intersection near whether in Poplar and Tenant that's completely burned down except for that front facade, that can't stay like that. So if we say we're going to do apartment complexes, we're still going to have to address that. However, I will tell y'all too, we've got some timelines that we now do with demolition versus rehab. We have one that we took to court starting in May of 2020. That's when we filed our petition. It was down by August. So if you're demolishing single family structures, you're going to see that much quicker. If we do a rehab, we had a petition that went that same day in court, May of 2020. It was finally CO'd in November of that year. That one was pretty quick. That was 6 months. So you're just gonna have to realize if everybody is willing for us to be able to either say, yeah, we got that one that's been burned out, or that, you know, a tree is through the middle of it, or a car drove through it, that's gonna have to go on the list. We can do that, but if you want us to really concentrate on getting units reestablished in this community, I think that's either gonna have to be through rehab, which is going to be more timely, or through apartments, which is going to be more legally challenging. So that's sort of our question, yeah.
To go back on what we would do individually, I guess my second biggest thing, was I'm on the land bank board now, and as y'all talked about, there are a lot of properties that the land bank has. A lot of them, I'd be willing to say 35, 40%, maybe even higher, are former city Griffin nuisance cases. They're now vacant lots that we have to lien on, and now they're in land bank. They didn't care about the house, they're not gonna care about the taxes. I guess my second thing, apartments is the biggest issue, but the second thing is, again, that we still have to go after the ones like Jessica stated, in terms of a car running through a fire, tree, anything like that that's not addressed, we have to take care of. But the biggest thing that comes to my mind after the apartments is location. We have all of these lots just sporadically placed throughout the city, where it almost makes redevelopment impossible, because you've got 2 lots here that are land bank, and then you've got 3 semi-substandard, might be owner occupied, might be landlord tenant, and then you maybe have a couple more. But that would be a best case scenario. More often than not, you have 2 parcels on an entire street that are land bank, and then you have to go to the next street over to get to your next one. So if we, I don't know if we focused on maybe a specific area that might lead to more redevelopment potential versus just going after these as has been done in the past, now that the most problematic ones have been dealt with.
But having ownership title of those lots, what you told me is the issue.
The land bank can still sell them. The land bank just tells the buyer that they can work with their closing attorney, whether it's Becko and Murray or whoever they choose, to go after the quiet title, and then they will have clear title. The land bank does have that in the process. The land bank just does not pay for that to be done. We give, the information is provided to the buyer to do that. But just the sporadically placed lots makes it near impossible for the land bank, as you had stated, to create those redevelopment aspects. Right now, you're only talking about, okay, well, here's one lot on this street, two lots on this one, and so forth. So I guess that would be the next biggest thing in terms of revitalizing an area, not just an individual lot.
More, as y'all talked about, the land bank training was to figure out the adjacent property owner, figure out how to.
Right, the side lot program.
To assign to.
If it is an owner occupant, the land bank will reach out through its staff. The land bank will reach out to that property owner and see if they'd be interested in not paying for that parcel, but just acquiring that parcel, and then it's their responsibility to combine it through community development, and then of course record the deed. But at that point, it gets that portion of land back on the tax registry, and it doesn't just sit there vacant.
Would it be worth also looking at giving it to investment property too, where it's reducing the number of lots and they end up getting the responsibility of keeping it cut and clear?
That's where it becomes problematic with the new IGA that was just passed. It specifically prohibits speculation. So if someone doesn't do anything within a year on a property, they have to give it back to the land bank.
But if you're merging lots, small lots to make one bigger lot, is it?
Most of those lots are non-conforming because they came into existence before our zoning ordinance.
So
So
would
we
be
would prefer that they become conforming by putting them back next door and saying, yeah,
Because
you
you're not
you
gonna-
take care of both.
I'm
of
just
these.
saying, you're just basically getting rid of that liability and putting it, you're making it a conforming lot.
Right, or at least bringing it closer, taking a 0.10 acre to a 0.2 acre in MDR. At least it's closer in the right direction.
Vast majority of.
But they wouldn't be building anything on that lot anyway.
They wouldn't.
Right, it still doesn't
So
help
it's-
with our units.
So
or
whether
anything.
it's owner occupied or whether it's tenant occupied, you're at least getting those lots.
I will say the land bank has not reached out to any tenant occupied for the side lot program. They only reach out if it's owner occupied.
And I would be willing to entertain, variances, if we're combining lots and we're not quite, maybe we're instead of 0.25, maybe we're 0.23. I'd entertain a variance for that all day long, to make it a viable.
That way they at least have a larger yard.
Because you're getting rid of two, like, itty bitty ones, and then, we're getting closer and getting to where we want to be. And I work with folks all day long in that regard.
And I guess my last concern, Jessica's gonna have to shoot me, I can be a little wordy. My last concern in respect to the apartments and the property maintenance inspection, we can go in there and we can do that, but one thing to keep in mind is a lot of times, we work for months on a project and the judge may or may not agree with us, and then we end up with something not like that one, but the property on Thurman, where at the end of the day, that property was reissued a certificate of occupancy. It met all minimum codes, and now today, we're right back to where it was before. So I guess that's another thing, and we have to follow the state statute for nuisance, but we're kind of relying on the property owner to make sure they understand what we want as a city. Like the one on Poplar Street, that's what we want. We don't want something we're gonna have to deal with 2 years later, but we don't have that we don't have that enforcement aspect.
That doubles back to Roseview too, which is why we're all these individuals out of call, like, hey, I'm gonna go in here and bring this property up to code. We're not interested in you bringing it up to code. We want to see something. I need to blow my hair back on this.
Well, and the reason we have the upper hand there, that's a little bit different situation. If if they had not appealed that and we just had a municipal court order, it'd be demolished. But because they have appealed that, there's obviously an interest for them as well to say, I don't want to go through a jury trial, especially, that's going to be very expensive for them, and then possibly end up with the same outcome. I don't see how they can't end up with the same outcome. It's worse than when we started. It certainly meets at least the mathematical formulation of a nuisance. My concern with the judge is that they may base it off of a rental-based income approach for that market value, and that's $880,000, or that's the last one I saw. Well, if that's the case, then it probably is worth them spending about 4 or 5 to fix it up and bring it back up to code. But my argument still is, it's not, you can't occupy it. So it's not $880,000. It's worth whatever that value of the structure is currently in the land that it sits on. Ken Fletcher would have to testify to that for us, and it's not worth bringing it up to code in this instance because it's going to be worth, you're going to spend more than what it's worth. So that's why I think that argument goes a lot better with a jury than it does a judge.
What direction does this board, some ideas, or where do we want to come back and digest this and then discuss it again? Where,
I need a day or two to digest,
That's fine.
because it's a lot.
It is a lot, and I'm sorry we took a lot of time, but we knew we were sort of gonna have to do that to give y'all a full understanding of where we are, because we're certainly, and I think in a very good way, not where we were 10 years ago. We can see, like you said, we can put out all the numbers you wanna put out and say, hey, we're doing a really good job, and everybody calls us because they wanna know how to do it, even across the street, calls us and say, how do we do it? But we don't feel like as a staff, and I think it was apparent for me and Chad at least at the goals workshop, that y'all don't really feel like it's making that much of an impact either, or at least as a goal to get that close to saying, yeah, we tore down 50, that should be a huge ordeal, but it's not, because we're not, I don't feel like helping the citizens. We're tearing down a landlord's house that lives in Atlanta and she didn't even know that we tore it down until a year later when the land bank got it. What good does that do anybody? Nothing. So that's sort of how we're looking at it now.
and we were also going to talk about property maintenance in regards to how we were going to raise the bar to start doing more citations in regards to paint, rotted facial boards.
Yeah, and code enforcement is working on that now. If it doesn't meet the standard of a nuisance, then they do go ahead and issue, what we do first is notices to say you have 20 days to give us some kind of construction schedule to let us know what it is you're going to do with this property. If you don't do that, then we can issue citations. One of the issues we're running into lately is that any of our code enforcement citations are only set once a month. And then when they get set, somebody walks in here and says, well, I want an attorney. And Judge Howell says, I'm gonna give somebody the opportunity for an attorney. My argument in that civil case is they don't have a right to it. But he's not willing to go forward with it. So then you're another month out. And then, you know, we're having a little bit of issue there that I'm trying to work with Mr. Mayfield and Judge Howell on that to say, these are important cases for us. We did a lot of background work before we got it to court. This isn't, I ran a stop sign on this particular day and now I don't do that anymore. So will you reduce it? Because my driving history is really good. We did all that on the front end before we ever issued that citation. So this isn't something that needs to be dismissed. It needs to be lowered because they got it fixed after they issued the citation. So that's a work in progress.
We're issuing more and more of those. I mean, we sent one out on Monday and I sent one out yesterday for those violations. So they're picking up pace with those, especially now that, you know, there's 3 officers and we're looking for a 4th. It's the amount of citations are picking up greatly.
Any other questions or comments or direction or request? We all appreciate your hard work and efforts. And this has been my entire life, it's been an issue that I've been aware of and we've worked towards moving in a more positive direction. So overall, I think we're doing a great job. Nothing money can't fix, but looking at what we have in terms of roughly $100,000+ in the new substandard fund, I think Cora's question about what we do with $1 million, kind of sit on that and think, what could we potentially do that would have that tsunami effect of real change for the greater good for the citizens? Everyone's good? To tonight, 6 o'clock?
Yes.
Good. Adjourn.
Moved.